Afternoon. A commercial flight from New York to Dallas. The aircraft is steady at cruising altitude. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, sits in economy with his 9-year-old son, Ethan. In the row ahead, Victoria Langford, a 27-year-old tech CEO, sits impatiently. Due to a seating error, she was placed near the back. She looks at Daniel's old jacket and sighs. This section is going to be a long flight. A few people snicker. Daniel stays silent, adjusting his son's headphones. 20 minutes later, the intercom crackles. "Is there a pilot on board? Please identify yourself." Daniel looks up. Now, Daniel Brooks was a man of steel, silence, and absolute rhythmic routine. At 41, his face was a map of quiet focus and the deep, enduring weariness of a man who lived two lives, one to keep a small home safe and one to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. He was currently employed as a senior technical inspector for a regional logistics firm. A job that involved a lot of clipboards, safety checklists, and remarkably little excitement. To the neighbors in his modest suburb, Daniel was just the quiet guy who mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings and never missed a parent-teacher conference. He wore simple, durable clothes, drove a 10-year-old truck, and rarely spoke about himself. But Daniel had a history that could melt the very air. 12 years ago, he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy, a Tier 1 strike pilot flying F-18 Super Hornets off the deck of a carrier in the Persian Gulf. He had logged over 3,000 flight hours, half of them in combat zones where the margin for error was less than a heartbeat. He had seen the world from 50,000 feet at Mach 1.8, navigated through sandstorms that blinded the radar, and brought his wingman home when the sky was screaming with lead. He was a master of energy management and high-stakes decision-making. In that world, he was known as Vortex. But then, the world stopped spinning. His wife, Elena, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive illness. Daniel didn't hesitate. He resigned his commission, walked away from the fast track to Admiral, and landed his jet for the last time. He needed to be on the ground. He needed to be the father who was there for every doctor's appointment, every bad dream, and every Tuesday afternoon at the park. After Elena passed away, Daniel systematically dismantled his old life. He put his medals in a box in the attic, hung up his flight suit, and chose a career that would never take him away from home for more than 8 hours at a time. He traded the roar of the afterburners for the silence of a little girl's bedroom. He became invisible by choice. Today, Daniel and his son, Ethan, were traveling to Dallas for a rare treat, a visit to a specialized aviation museum. Ethan was 9, a bright, inquisitive boy who lived in a world of plastic models and aerospace magazines. He knew his dad used to fly, but the details were vague, colored only by the occasional story Daniel told at bedtime. They were squeezed into seats 24B and 24C, surrounded by the hum of the cabin and the smell of stale pretzels. Daniel was wearing his favorite faded canvas jacket, a garment that had seen more rain than sun. Victoria Langford sat in 23D. At 27, she was the CEO of a fast-growing software conglomerate, a woman who measured her worth in quarterly growth and the prestige of her network. She was sharp, decisive, and currently wearing a look of profound irritation. A booking error had bumped her from the first-class cabin to the middle of the plane, and she felt as if she were an aristocrat exiled to a village. She tapped her designer heels against the carpet, her eyes scanning the ordinary people around her with a clinical, detached judgment. When Daniel accidentally bumped her seat while helping Ethan with his backpack, Victoria turned around, her expression a mask of icy condescension. She looked at Daniel's worn boots, the frayed collar of his shirt, and the little boy holding a coloring book. She let out a short, sharp sigh that was loud enough for the entire row to hear. "I suppose this section is going to be a very long flight," she said, her voice dripping with a casual, unearned arrogance. "It's difficult to focus on a $6 billion merger when you're surrounded by, well, the local commute." A few businessmen nearby, eager to align themselves with someone of her status, chuckled softly. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't flush with anger or try to explain his service record. He had been in cockpits where the G-force was trying to crush his ribs. A CEO's comment was just static on the radio. He simply checked Ethan's seatbelt and whispered, "It's okay, pal. Everyone has their own weather. We just stay on our heading." He settled into his seat, closing his eyes, listening to the pitch of the engines. He knew the plane was at 34,000 feet. He knew the wind was coming from the northwest at 40 knots. He knew the aircraft was trimmed perfectly. He was a ghost in seat 24B, a man who had conquered the sky and was now content to simply sit under it. But the sky has a way of calling its masters back, and Daniel Brooks was about to realize that some titles you never truly walk away from. The flight had been steady for the first hour, the rhythmic white noise of the cabin acting as a lullaby for most of the passengers. Victoria Langford was buried in her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she reviewed the final clauses of her deal. Daniel was watching a documentary with Ethan, sharing a single pair of headphones. Then the vibration changed. To a normal passenger, it was just a bump, a bit of clear air turbulence. But to Daniel, it was a diagnostic report. He felt a subtle, high-frequency shudder through the floorboards, a microscopic stutter in the engine synchronization. It was followed by a faint metallic tink that suggested a bypass valve had cycled when it shouldn't have. He sat up, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the front of the plane. He noticed the lead flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Sarah, walk quickly toward the cockpit. She didn't look panicked, but she was moving with a rigid, urgent speed that suggested a condition yellow. She entered the code and disappeared inside. 3 minutes passed. She didn't come out. Daniel felt a familiar, cold clarity settle over him, the kind of clarity he used to feel when the radar warning receiver started chirping in his ear. He saw another attendant, a younger man, move to the galley and pick up the interphone. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he spoke to the cabin crew in the rear. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life. The voice wasn't the captain's. It was the lead flight attendant, Sarah. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp, brittle edge to it that only a professional would catch. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the cabin lead. We are currently experiencing a minor technical situation in the flight deck. If there is a licensed commercial or military pilot on board, please ring your call bell or identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. This is a precautionary measure. I repeat, any pilot on board, please identify yourself now." The cabin went from a hum to a vacuum. The silence was heavy, suffocating. People stopped chewing. People stopped typing. Victoria Langford froze, her tablet halfway to her lap. She looked around, her eyes wide with a sudden primal fear. The $6 billion merger vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying realization that she was currently trapped in a 30-ton tube of metal miles above the ground, and something was wrong with the people in charge. The man sitting across from Victoria, a corporate lawyer who had been nodding at her earlier, started to breathe fast. "Is the pilot dead? Are we going to crash?" "Oh God, they never ask that unless it's the end." "Stay calm," Daniel said. His voice was no longer the soft rumble of a dad. It was a resonant, grounding baritone that seemed to vibrate through the seats. It was a frequency that demanded and received immediate attention. Daniel looked at the row. No one was standing. No one was ringing their bell. In the front rows where the elite travelers sat, there was only paralyzed silence. The important people were waiting for someone else to be important. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt. The sound of the metal clasp was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Ethan looked up at his father, his grip tightening on Daniel's arm. "Dad, is the plane okay? Are you going to help the dragon?" Daniel knelt down, placing his hands on Ethan's shoulders. He looked into his son's eyes with a confidence that was as solid as bedrock. "The plane is strong, Ethan. The co-pilot just needs an extra set of eyes to check the maps. It's just like when we practice our checklists at home. I want you to stay right here, keep your belt tight, and finish your drawing. I'll be right back, I promise." "Okay, Dad," Ethan whispered, his chest puffing out just a little as he tried to match his father's courage. Daniel stood up. As he stepped into the aisle, Victoria Langford stared at him. She looked at his scuffed jacket, the grease on his knuckles, and the way he moved, with a heavy, purposeful grace that didn't belong to a commuter. "You? she whispered, her voice shaky. You're the one who's going to help? You're just a... Daniel didn't look at her. He didn't have time for her weather anymore. He walked toward the front of the plane, his stride steady and unhurried. As he reached the galley, Sarah, the lead attendant, met him. She saw the man in the old jacket and her heart sank. She was expecting a man in a pilot uniform or at least a sharp suit. "Sir, are you a licensed pilot?" she asked, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. Daniel didn't make a speech. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, laminated card. His FAA Senior Flight Instructor certificate and his retired Navy ID. "Daniel Brooks," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I have 10,000 hours in heavy jets and 3,000 in strike fighters. I'm current on multi-engine ratings. Tell me the status of the captain." Sarah's eyes widened as she read the card. She didn't see a nobody anymore. She saw the vortex. She felt a wave of relief, so intense she almost stumbled. "The captain has had a mild stroke, sir. He's conscious but paralyzed on his left side. The first officer is flying the plane, but he's a junior, only 200 hours on this type. He's overwhelmed with the emergency descent and the radio. He needs a second." Daniel nodded once. "Take me in." The code was entered. The armored door swung wide. Daniel Brooks stepped into the cockpit, and the world of economy class, $6 billion mergers, and judgmental glares was left far behind. He was home. The cockpit was a wall of glowing digital displays, flashing amber lights, and a cacophony of audio alerts. The first officer, a young man named Tyler, whose face was white with sheer, unadulterated terror, was wrestling with the yoke. The captain was slumped in the left seat, his breathing shallow, his left arm hanging uselessly. "I can't get the descent rate to stabilize," Tyler shouted over the noise of the master caution alarm. "The auto throttles are disconnected and the pitch trim is fighting me." Daniel moved into the narrow space, his presence immediately lowering the temperature in the room. He didn't touch anything yet. He observed. He saw the situation in its entirety. The hydraulic pressure drop in System B, the airspeed fluctuations, and the mounting workload on the young co-pilot. "Tyler," Daniel said, his voice low and authoritative, "look at me." The young pilot glanced over, his eyes frantic. "My name is Daniel. I'm a Navy flight lead. I've landed Hornets on pitching decks in the dark with one engine on fire. You are doing a great job holding the wings level, but you're trying to do too much. I am going to sit in the left seat. I will handle the radios, the checklists, and the systems management. You will stay on the controls. You will be the hands. I will be the eyes. Together, we are going to bring this bird down to Dallas. Do you copy?" Tyler swallowed hard, his breathing starting to slow. He felt the weight of Daniel's experience like a physical shield. "Copy, sir. I have the controls." "Good," Daniel said. He leaned over the captain. "Captain Miller, I'm Daniel. I'm taking your seat for a while. We're going to get you on the ground into a hospital. Just relax." With Sarah's help, they carefully moved the captain to the jump seat. Daniel slid into the left-hand command chair. He felt the familiar embrace of the cockpit, the smell of electronics and filtered air. He adjusted the pedals, checked the HUD, and began to work the overhead panels with a speed that left Tyler breathless. "Dallas Center, this is Sky West 402. We have a medical emergency in the flight deck. Declaring a mayday, we have an incapacitated PIC and a secondary hydraulic failure. Requesting priority descent to 10,000 feet and direct routing to DFW runway 18 right." The radio responded instantly, the controller's voice sharp and focused. "Sky West 402, Mayday acknowledged. You are cleared for the descent. High-speed approach is authorized. Clear the sky, 402. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of terrifying uncertainty. The plane banked sharply as it began its emergency descent. Victoria Langford clutched her armrests, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door. She watched as the attendants moved with condition-red urgency. She thought about the man she had mocked. She remembered the grease on his hands. She realized that her entire existence, her legacy, her deal, her life was now resting in those greasy hands. For the next 20 minutes, Daniel was a machine of logic and precision. He ran the emergency landing checklists, calculated the new approach speeds to account for the hydraulic lag, and guided Tyler through every correction. "Watch your sync rate, Tyler," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the monitors. "Increase power to 60%. We're going to be heavy on the touchdown because we can't dump the fuel in time. I'll handle the reverse thrusters and the braking. You just keep the nose on the center line." "Sir, how do you stay so calm?" Tyler asked, his voice shaking. "Because the plane doesn't care how you feel, Tyler," Daniel replied, his voice a steady anchor. "It only cares what you do. If you follow the physics will save you. Now give me the landing gear." The heavy thud of the landing gear locking into place vibrated through the plane. As they broke through the cloud layer, the lights of Dallas appeared, a sea of gold and white stretching to the horizon. Daniel looked at the runway, his eyes narrowing, his mind calculating the crosswind component. He felt the aircraft breathe. He felt the Dragon settle. As they touched the tarmac, the landing was firm but perfect. The thrust reversers roared, the brakes gripped with a high-pitched scream, and the 100-ton machine slowed to a safe taxi speed. Daniel stayed in the seat until the emergency medical teams boarded the plane and evacuated the captain. Only then did he exhale. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for Elena, how she would have smiled at him today. He realized he hadn't just saved a plane, he had honored the promise he made to her. He had stayed on the ground until he was needed in the sky, and he had done his job. He unbuckled his harness, gave Tyler a firm, supportive handshake, and walked out of the cockpit. The door swung open, and Daniel Brooks stepped back into the cabin. The silence that met him was absolute. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of awe. The passengers were standing in the aisle, their faces masks of profound gratitude and disbelief. Victoria Langford was standing in her row, her tablet forgotten on the floor. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the vortex. She saw the man who had seen the edge of the world and come back. The nobody in the scuffed jacket was the most important person she would ever meet. The walk back to seat 24B was a gauntlet of human emotion. People were reaching out to touch his sleeve, whispering, "Thank you," and "God bless you." A businessman who had laughed at Victoria's joke earlier stood up and offered a sharp, respectful nod, his face flushed with shame. Daniel didn't look for the applause. He didn't stop for the handshakes. He had a singular mission. He reached his row and saw Ethan. The little boy was standing on his seat, his eyes shimmering with a pride so intense it seemed to light up the cabin. "Did you help the pilot, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice ringing through the quiet plane. Daniel smiled, picking his son up and hugging him tight. "I just helped him read the map, pal. The co-pilot did all the hard work." A man in the row behind them, a retired commercial pilot himself, looked at Daniel. "I heard the radio chatter on the scanners, son. That wasn't just reading a map. You handled that hydraulic failure like a pro. Were you a pilot?" Daniel nodded simply. "Navy, F-18s. A long time ago." Victoria Langford stood just 3 feet away. The Ice Queen was gone. She looked small in her designer suit, her eyes red from the adrenaline and the realization of her own arrogance. She watched Daniel talk to his son, saw the tenderness in his hands and the absolute lack of ego in his voice. She realized that the local commute she had mocked was the only reason she was still breathing. As the plane taxied to the gate and the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, no one rushed for the doors. They waited. They waited for Daniel to gather his things. For the first time in aviation history, the deplaning process was silent and respectful. Victoria stepped into the aisle, blocking Daniel's path for a second. She didn't look like a CEO. She looked like a student. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice barely a whisper, I want to apologize for what I said earlier. I was incredibly wrong. I judged you by a jacket and a seat number. I had no idea who I was sitting next to." Daniel looked at her, his hazel eyes clear and surprisingly kind. He didn't hold a grudge. He didn't have room for it in his system. "It's all right, Ms. Langford. Travel days are stressful. We all have our blind spots. Just remember, the most important parts of a flight are the ones you never see on the ticket." He moved past her, holding Ethan's hand. As they walked through the jet bridge, the airport manager and a small crowd of airline officials were waiting. They wanted to take Daniel to a private lounge, to offer him free flights for life, to set up a press conference. Daniel politely but firmly declined it all. "I'm just here for the museum," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair. "And I think my son has had enough excitement for one day. We just want a quiet hotel room and some dinner." They walked through the terminal, two ordinary people in a sea of travelers. But the news had already traveled faster than the jet. People were pointing, whispering about the mystery pilot. Daniel kept his head down, focusing entirely on the little boy beside him. He wasn't the hero of Flight 402 to himself. He was just a dad who had kept a promise. He had gone up into the clouds to help, and now he was finally back on the ground where he belonged. The landing at Dallas was safe, but the landing in Daniel's life was even more significant. The next morning, Daniel and Ethan were standing in front of the Heroes of the Navy exhibit at the museum. Ethan was pointing at a photo of an F-18, explaining the wing configuration to a group of other kids. A shadow fell over them. Daniel turned to see Victoria Langford. She wasn't wearing the suit today. She was in a simple sweater and jeans, her hair down, looking strangely human in the morning light. "I hoped I'd find you here," she said, her voice warm. "I did some research last night. I found the logs for the vortex. I found the stories about the Bering Sea rescue." Daniel gave a small, humble shrug. "That was a different life, Victoria." "Was it?" she asked, looking at Ethan. "I spent my whole life thinking that being a CEO meant being the most important person in the room. I thought that if I wasn't the loudest, I wasn't winning. But yesterday, I saw real power. It wasn't in the title. It was in the silence. It was in the way you stayed calm when everyone else was screaming." She looked at the F-18 in the photo, then back at Daniel. "I misjudged you, Daniel. I thought you were just a commuter, but you're the architect of the whole sky." Ethan looked at Victoria, his chest puffing out with pride. "My dad used to fly the fast jets. He says the stars are much closer up there." Victoria smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She looked at Daniel, and for a second, the distance between the CEO and the technical inspector vanished. "Looks like he still does fly the fast jets, Ethan. He just does it on the ground now. He's the one holding the line for you." She handed Daniel a small, handwritten card. "My personal number. No assistance. If you ever want to talk about things that don't involve mergers or flight paths, I'd like to buy you and Ethan dinner. A real dinner, not in economy." Daniel laughed, a warm, rich sound that echoed in the museum hangar. "I think we can manage that, but on one condition." "What's that?" "You have to let Ethan explain the physics of a carrier landing first. He's the real expert in the family." Victoria laughed. "Deal." As Victoria walked away, Daniel looked at the fighter jet in the exhibit. He realized then that he didn't need the uniform to be a pilot. He didn't need the 4 stripes to be a leader. He was a father, a protector, and a man who knew exactly when to step up. True strength. It isn't found in a job title or a bank account. It's found in the quiet integrity of your actions when the world asks for help. It's found in the courage to stay true to yourself, even when people only see the old jacket. Daniel Brooks held his son's hand and walked toward the next exhibit. He was exactly where he needed to be. The vortex was at peace. True excellence is a silent habit. Never judge a person by the surface of their life, for the most ordinary people often carry the most extraordinary histories. Real power lies not in the position you hold, but in the character you show when the stakes are at their highest. If you believe that character is more valuable than any corporate title, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you have had the courage to step forward, or would you have stayed in your seat?